thankfully, I can hand over the reins now to the very experienced and articulate Virginia Teehan, CEO of the Heritage Council, who's going to both chair the session and have a friendly discussion with some really key people in the heritage world in Ireland today. Thank you very much. Please take your seats and we'll get started. Thank you. Virginia. Would you like to speak here?
Muirne buíochas Nessa, and the theme of this session is identifying skills needs in Irish heritage professionals. And this is a very pertinent theme given the subject matter of the Charter Alliance work, and indeed given the number of discussions which are happening in the Irish heritage world around skills training and the requirement to provide additional supports for skills enhancement and also to support research, as I was referencing earlier. We have a very experienced and expert panel to discuss these matters this morning. I'm joined immediately to my right by Michael O'Boyle, who is a member of the Buildings of Ireland, a chair of the Irish Landmark Trust, a council member of the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland, and is a conservation architect. Secondly, we have Lynn Scarff, Director of the National Museum of Ireland. Then we have Professor Elizabeth Crooke, Professor of Heritage and Museum Studies, Ulster University. Then beside Elizabeth is Janet Hancock, Chair of the Archives and Records Association, Ireland, and also Director of the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland. Beside Janet is Barbara Neefline, Lecturer in Irish Folklore at University College Dublin. And then sitting beside Barbara is Muirne Lydon, Chair of the Institute of Conservators-Restorers in Ireland and a Conservator at the National Gallery of Ireland. So to kick this morning's dialogue off, the organisers have kindly supplied us with a number of topics that they'd like us to cover. And these topics are all based around the area of the current concerns around deficits in skills and training across the sector in Ireland. So the way in which this dialogue will be structured is that I will pose a few questions to the participants on the panel, and then hopefully we will have a constructive discussion which will inform your deliberations later on in the day. So, Elizabeth, I think you're probably very well placed to discuss training needs given your role as a trainer at the University of Ulster. And can you let me know, is the training we have in place adequate to fill the gaps in skill sets? And if not, how do we need to better connect education with industry to create a supply and a demand relationship?
Good morning, everybody. It's a delight to be on this panel with all these wonderful people. And you're right, Virginia, training really has been my bread and butter from day one of joining a university to work on a museum and heritage studies programme. So at Ulster, for those of you who don't know our programmes, at Ulster University we run two master's programmes, one cultural heritage and museum studies based on the Belfast campus, and the other is museum practice and management, which is a distance learning programme, and that programme was developed with the Heritage Council with an eye on the Museum Standards Programme for Ireland. So our modules very much tie in with the requirements of the Museum Standards Programme and acknowledges and uses standards from the UK accreditation programme and the wider example of programmes worldwide. So because I've been doing this for 20 years, I have a whole network of alumni across the museum sector in Ireland, and you really see what skills you need. So on the one hand, I've an eye on my students coming into the programme, and I want them to be very employable when they leave the programme. and feel that they have a good suite of skills. But also, while they're on the course, it's really around trying to establish people who are ambitious for the sector, who are prepared to be radical if they need to be radical in their work, and feel that they have a whole support network. And that support network is not only the students in the room with them, who will become their peers in the museum and heritage world, but also the supports network of the universities. And we continue to work and collaborate with our alumni. And I think, as regards skill sets, when you look out on the heritage landscape today, you know, you've got a number of crises that are ongoing. We have the cost of living crisis, so when our graduates go into the world of work, they have to argue why money needs to be spent on heritage. They need to go to their stakeholders, they need to go to their local council, their local authorities, they need to be able to go to the Department for Communities, a sponsor branch for museums, they need to go to their local people in their local area and say, yes, invest in heritage. So they need, you know, we all need to have the language in order to convince people and know, you know, what evidence do we need to prove the absolute worth of heritage to people in local authorities and councils and so on, who may, you know, have very difficult decisions to make about where to spend their money. So that's the cost of living crisis. We've also got a whole, if you want to call it a crisis, well, yes, it is crises, around sort of threats to the museum and heritage world, practitioners and leaders who want to address legacies. So you've got the whole legacies of colonialism, you've got evidences of racism built into our museum systems, our heritage systems, our landscapes, our archives that we want to address. And heritage and museum people, I don't know, I'm not going to speak for Ireland, but certainly in the UK system, you know, are under threat now and again from sort of political interference, if you want to call it that, for wanting to address the origins of their collections. And this is not just in museums, this is in landscape work from sort of colonial countryside type projects. And then there's other, we've just come out of COVID, which of course was a massive impact on everybody. And again, that was another crisis, and museums and heritage world certainly stepped up to the mark to prove our worth at such a time. So those are the sort of debates that we have in our classrooms, so that our students can look at policy, at the values. And I very much, in the classroom, encourage the students to bring their own values, because, as we all know, heritage is not neutral. Museums are not neutral, and sitting in the room, each of those people will have social, cultural, political values of their own, which I think are relevant to their workplace. So that's the sort of training landscape I work in, and I don't know if I've spoken for too long.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I'll let you know. But just to follow on those points, Elizabeth, and you raised the complex context within which people find themselves, and they really can be summarised, the difficulty of the absence of funding and the need for advocacy and the ability to articulate the ambition for the protection of heritage. The fact that, which is very much a current topic, that discussions around the value of collections in light of current research around decolonisation, the role of past nations, legacy issues, are all serious social and political issues as well, and the role of the professional in navigating through those difficult waters is key. And then finally, the issue which affects everyone across society is the post-COVID society. So that's a very demanding world in which to insert a young professional. So therefore, do you think we need to be better at acknowledging and accrediting the mastery of the discipline of professional practice and heritage?
I think there's a lot of programs out there that are supporting, and I think there is very good support out there for people who come through the sort of the university sector. But, I think there's a wider ecosystem there, and I think some of the others here can speak to that as well. And you all in the room will have experience of that whole broad ecosystem of heritage skills that are necessary right through to, like, I was having conversations with somebody on the route here and with Mary, who's in the room somewhere, and we were talking about thatching and Donegal. We need that full range, and I think others will speak to that full range of skills. But do I have time for one quick example? Or
Just a quickie.
Yeah. There's a beautiful example of the Irish workhouse restoration project in Enniskillen. And that workhouse project was a collaboration between the Northwest Regional College or the Southwest Regional College in Enniskillen and Fermanagh Omagh District Council. And one of the most beautiful moments in that restoration project, at the very end, one of the carpenters presented the museum officer with a box. And within that box is a shoe that the workmen found in the rafters of the workhouse. But what is even more special about that box, and it was a gift, to mark the end of the project from the carpenter, was that he used timbers that had been salvaged from the 19th century building that couldn't be reused in the building. And as a surprise, he had made this box for Catherine to put the shoe in, so she could treasure this shoe. And Catherine is going to put that box back in the rafters with a modern day shoe. So in a way, that is an example of all the trades, the trade of the carpenter, the trade of the person in the rafters, the trade of the museum professional working, and all of them knowing the sort of symbolic and cultural and political and social value of what they were doing. And I think that's a beautiful example of that ecosystem of skills in every sort of piece of the jigsaw that is sort of the heritage landscape.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. And on that sense of talking about applied skills and the importance of the expertise of skilled professionals, I'd just like to ask Muirne, who is a professional conservator, if you could look at two areas where you have identified gaps in skill sets in your field, and do you think the training is adequate and the actions we need to pursue to fill those gaps?
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. It's lovely to be here today with everybody to talk about these topics. Well, just first, if I could give you a brief overview. As Virginia said, I'm here in my capacity as chair of the Irish Conservators and Restorers in Ireland, so ICRI, which was founded in 1991 in order to promote the conservation and restoration of Ireland's cultural heritage. And we do this by setting standards of professional practice, by operating a process of accreditation and training for our members, as well as being an active voice in the development of cultural heritage policy in Ireland. So I think one of the reasons I was invited here is because the Institute in 2021 did a survey with the support of the Heritage Council. We commissioned a survey, an audit of conservation skills and experience in Ireland. So to be able to provide with some kind of key data or key results of that. The aims of this audit were to determine the current conservation skills and experience available within the country, to identify the conservation skills and services required by the heritage sector, and to take a hard look at those skill deficits or gaps in material expertise in Ireland. And then finally, we looked at where are the future skills and training, where are those future skills and training needs, where are they? And then also to identify areas requiring additional support and to inform strategic planning of the Institute and then also other training bodies within the country. So the results of that study provided evidence to quantify conservation skills currently available in Ireland and in private practice and within all of the cultural organisations. And the survey really was very beneficial. It highlighted the breadth of skills available in the country, with over 42 conservation disciplines recorded, including such as oil conservation, paintings conservation, paper, furniture, archaeology, textiles, ceramics, buildings and sculpture, including also archive and paper-based conservation. We identified that the respondents held a significant level of practical knowledge, with expertise of 45% of the 135 Conservators surveyed having over 20 years' experience within the conservation sector. So while that's good, because we're a very high level of experienced practitioners, also to go back to what we were talking about with the cost of living crisis, we will be heading into an area where we want early career conservators to come in, and that's becoming more and more difficult to come into Ireland with the price of living and all of that. So certainly the reliance on Irish freelance conservators was very clear within this survey, with over 90% of our cultural institutions responding to having used private services within the last 5 years. The results highlighted potential gaps in professional skills and material expertise across all of those disciplines that I spoke about within the country. And ICRI is playing a crucial role in addressing these deficits by providing targeted training to meet the needs of our members and the heritage sector in these needs that were identified. So we look at continuing to promote the profession and support early career conservators to help ensure these skills and specialisms can continue to grow and are not lost. So in addition to technical and analytical skills, Virginia asked me to identify 2 areas. Some of the other areas that were highlighted for more training focused on ideas of collection care, preventive conservation, and also environmental awareness and sustainability was identified with equal priority of these 2 areas. And I think it's interesting to note how we're progressing with training, or how we're developing our CPD training within the country. That the perceived skill deficits in the categories requested for CPD training identified in an earlier survey from 2013 were again reiterated in this most recent survey. So all of the areas that I've mentioned remain areas that require attention since 2013. So in 2013, there was also a real concern expressed around the lack of employment opportunities for conservators and restorers in Ireland. So it is encouraging to report that despite the impact of the recession and the pandemic, there has been a very gradual increase in posts recorded in cultural institutions. However, I still do want to flag most of the cultural institutions still remain chronically under-resourced, leaving staff in permanent firefighting positions. Many noted this as overwhelming at best, as everything remains reactive and long-term planning and strategy becomes highly challenging. And I think we're going to touch on this later in this roundtable session. So to go back to the key recommendations of the survey, the success and positive impact of the Heritage Council-sponsored conservation scheme was very clear in the results of the survey. This was established by the Heritage Council in 2006, and the scheme provides wonderful opportunities for recent conservation graduates to hone their skills and put theory into practice within a nurturing working environment. And as an accredited member pointed out in the survey, providing internships is a really essential task to developing our profession and create opportunities for the new generation in safe environments. However, due to financial constraints, participation in the scheme is currently only limited to national cultural institutions and Trinity College Library. So looking at this, with such a high percentage of conservators-restorers working in private practice are freelance, over 50% of the respondents worked in freelance. This seems to be perhaps a missed opportunity that we could look at for additional training opportunities. And perhaps by working with bodies like the Heritage Council and identifying additional sponsors, ICRI does advocate for the expansion of this programme to support highly experienced accredited conservators or restorers in offering salaried internships to recent graduates. We feel this would also provide an opportunity to guarantee that the wealth of experience and knowledge held by conservator restorers in Ireland is not lost but passed on to enable succession planning for the future. So it's really clear from the survey and the results that there is a deficit in expertise surrounding certain types of material. However, as stated by a national cultural institution, it's important to note that expertise in Ireland is of a very high standard, and it is mainly niche specialisms that may require expertise. But given the highly specialised nature of these certain areas, it may be inevitable that some of these skills will continue to be sourced abroad. We have to acknowledge we're periphery, we're a small country, and maybe these expertise, while there can be some training here, I think we'll always have that relationship that we need to bring them in as well. I see Virginia putting up the red pen. So I'm going to say, our relationship with the Heritage Council is a very positive one, and we look forward to continue that in the skills and development of CPD opportunities for conservators in the country. But I think Michael's going to talk about it in terms of statutory roles, and we know that architects and conservation architects have a statutory role within Ireland. We don't have that within those specialisms, those conservation specialisms that I mentioned. So, I mean, our role, we have to very much work with the stakeholders, work with public, work with private, and we can't impose standards on conservation. So we have to remain very open and welcoming in accreditation standards and CPD, and creating good environments for our conservators to upskill. And I look forward to doing that and evolving that in the years to come.
Thank you for that, Lynn. And our Muirne bandits, it's interesting that you reference the word standards there, because the Heritage Council has, since 2004, really been working on standards around cultural heritage collections, and the work we're doing with Elizabeth at the training for those working in institutions, and the opportunity for CPD training, mainly for curators and people working in galleries, has been modest, I think, but good. But in particular, we are concerned and wish to build on the internship programme we've developed with your own institute and with the national cultural institutions. And the point is well made around extending the programme beyond the national cultural institutions, because I think the earlier sessions this morning demonstrated, and I'm sure it's the case for colleagues in other European countries, that the role of communities in heritage is growing stronger, and it is so important. And our work must be community-led as much as expert-led. And I think introducing professional skills in conservation is important, because the role of the conservator is by its nature expert. And we are all here with a common goal to preserve heritage, and particularly the vulnerable heritage assets. And I think certainly in the Council, while we work hand in glove with communities, we also, on the other hand, are very clear that there are areas of professional expertise which are for the professionals. And we wish to grow and extend that work with conservation and also traditional building skills. I know it's something Michael will talk about, and I've just come from the UK to meet with colleagues around the All-Ireland Heritage Skills Programme. It's an innovative programme we develop with colleagues in Northern Ireland and the King's Foundation in the UK to build on excellence in conservation skills, but also to ensure that there are career opportunities for people in the sector. And moving on to Lynn, the Director of the National Museum, I mean, you're in a position where you're leading the major national cultural institution in the country. So from your perspective, how do we make cultural heritage a desirable career path for young people, and particularly for those who may wish to come back to education?
Thanks, Virginia. And again, just good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be part of such a great panel this morning. And I suppose my perspective this morning is as a director of a cultural institution, and thinking about what is needed in the context of a large institution with all of the tensions and challenges and opportunities that arise in leading a large institution. And how do we ensure that our spaces are places that are captivating and welcoming to people within this sector? And I suppose more so, as to Virginia's point, demonstrating clear kind of pathways. I think one of the things that interests me is that when I hear Elizabeth talking about her experience with students as they're at an undergraduate or postgraduate level, and hearing more about their expectations in terms of what they're going to meet when they're working in this sector, I think things like today are really important, because I think it's imperative that we start to understand better what kinds of transformations we need to make within our institutions, within the sectors that we work in, so that they are much more relevant to young people who are entering the sector right now. And I think that requires us to even start looking at how we put, I think, up front a lot more within our institutions the specialist skills in this sector that are at the core of what we do. I think in museums in particular, and I'll speak from the perspective of museums, we have done a huge amount of work, particularly during the pandemic, in demonstrating the relevance of our institutions, their importance in terms of well-being, in terms of engagement with community, and you can see through different projects that we do at its core how that's entering into hopefully every village and every town place across Ireland. I think within our institutions we have to demonstrate how those core skills within this sector are key to how our organisations work. And while I think within this room we may have a really good understanding here in ourselves about what that ecosystem is, I do wonder whether we do a good enough job or whether we are broadcasting that a bit wider. And I say that as somebody who has a job to do in making and case making consistently to government, to other potential partners about the criticality and the importance of those core skills to what we do and how transformative they can be within an institution. And so I do think there's a role to be played in a greater understanding of that. And I'll hold my hand up and say, you know, within the museum, I think ourselves, we need to do a greater job of demonstrating what the core work of the museum is and the importance of that core work, what it delivers, and how that's absolutely integral to the overall experience that we offer the visitor who ultimately walks through the door or who engages with our organisation online. I think then to then think about how that goes out then to people who are applying to jobs within our sector. One of the big challenges that we face, certainly within the museum, is I think a tightness of structures particularly within the public sector, that don't necessarily offer us the flexibility to recognise advanced skills. And by that, what I mean is that we have, you know, when people are coming into our sector, oftentimes they're starting at a kind of more or less along a similar grade. And I think I hear Muirne speak about how do we recognise the specialist skills at different points in the career pathway, so that when you have people who are either conservation expertise, archival expertise, that when they're coming into your institution, you have an ability to not only recognise their professional, CV in terms of roles that they've had, but also the skill sets that they've developed over time. I feel that we don't have a good, strong framework for that at the moment, and I think that could be something really interesting to explore in a European context. So I think that's one thing. And then I think as well, there's an onus on us as institutions to think about, Elizabeth is having students coming in who have absolute ambition and drive around transformation, around relevance within our sector, and how they can bring those energies and values into our institutions. And so as institutions, I think that we need to think about our strategic planning. I think we need to think about our own kind of work programs and values as organisations, so that those young people can see a place for them within those institutions. And I see the red pen.
Great.
Sorry.
I become known by the red pen, not in lines, but in the visual. And I think you raise a very important point there around the recognition of the experience and the expertise of particular heritage disciplines that are an essential part of institutional work, but also the wider work within heritage. And I think maybe it's something that Janet, who's here from the Archives and Records Association, which I know myself, I happen to be a member, is a chartered body in the UK, but you know, what is the role that professional bodies and professional acknowledgement and recognition plays perhaps hand in hand with the employment world, the world where Lynn and I are part of the wider public service? How can we work perhaps a little bit in greater alignment to recognise the importance of that expertise? And Michael, I know you're a professional architect and you're on the council of the Royal Institute of Architects. I mean, you work broadly in cultural and built heritage, and a bit like Lynn, what gaps do you see in the field, and how can those gaps be filled?
Thanks, Virginia, and hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I suppose within the built heritage sector, there are maybe two parallel strands, and that would be the professional, but also the practitioner and the craftsperson. And I suppose to talk about both in parallel, it's important to say that the statutory protections that Muirne referenced there have only been in place in Ireland for just coming up to 23 years, I think it is now. And there's been a big learning curve that the profession has had to go on since that happened. Within the RAI, we have developed, it about 20 years ago now, but we've refined it, a conservation accreditation system. And that is like a pyramid where every single member of the RAI is on that pyramid. At the entry level, there is the core baseline skills of the registered architect, which includes skills that relate to historic buildings, existing buildings, buildings of traditional construction. And then we encourage members to go on a journey of accreditation and continuing development. We have an entry level at grade 3, which is an intensive, lecture series plus an exam, which is quite robust. And then it takes about 10 to 15 years to get to the highest level on the pyramid, which would be grade 1. We don't have enough grade 1 and grade 2 conservation architects in the country. I guess we have about 70 at each of the 2 grades. It's not enough. Some of those people are in the public sector and therefore can't get involved in project work. Others are at different stages of their career. So we're very focused within the RAI to try and develop pathways and encourage younger members to go on this journey and become, more skilled and have a greater understanding in how to work with historic buildings. Within that context, we did a review about 4 years ago. We refined our standards, and what we looked at was we developed a skills matrix which looked at, two parameters which define what is required for a conservation project. That would be the significance of the building, but also the complexity of the project. And depending on where those 2 parameters align, it then tells you the level of expertise that you need. And we've tried to get that information out there to owners, to local authorities, to grant bodies, so that we can match the skill with the project. And I think this is really important for younger people who are at the beginning of their journey through accreditation, so that they can cut their teeth, that all the projects aren't going to more experienced people. It's not appropriate, and there just aren't enough of us. So I think that's really, really important. In parallel with that, to talk about the practitioner and the craftsperson, and I always say at the end of a successful job, I like to go and talk to the craftspeople and the various people who delivered the project and basically say, look, you are the guys who make me look good because they delivered the project, and I am the last person you want applying lime render on a wall or anything like that. Well able to talk the talk, but not so good if you put a trowel in my hands. There's a huge appetite out there within the construction sector, and I see it when I walk on a building site. People get very engaged when we talk about how you go about the process of conserving and restoring and repairing historic buildings. But I don't think there's yet enough of formal pathways for progression and for learning those skills. There are the beginnings of apprenticeships coming back, and I know the Heritage Council has worked very hard on that. For my own part, when I was on the Architecture Committee of the Heritage Council, when that existed, we looked at that, and I was involved quite heavily on it. But I think more needs to happen, and thinking about that, I think it needs to be a recognition within the construction industry that conservation is not a niche practice. Increasingly, we are going to be asked to deliver projects on buildings that exist, that have embodied carbon within them, rather than wasting carbon, demolishing them and rebuilding them. And that means that conservation skills and an understanding of how heritage is delivered needs to become mainstream. And that means that the construction industry and the big players within the construction industry need to understand that there's money in that, and they need to actually invest in delivering. So I suppose they would be the two areas I would see. There's maybe one gap,
Sure.
if I could. I think just to talk about the two strands, and I think this gap is evident both on the professional side and also on the practitioner side. The two strands within conservation would be the technology that you bring when you're delivering the project, but also the philosophy, the conservation philosophy that underlines or underpins the decision-making and the judgment calls that you have to make when you're dealing with a complex conservation project. I've noticed on the ground a huge uptake in understanding on technology. I no longer have to get out of the car when I do a grant inspection and explain to a building owner or a contractor about lime or about how to repair a window and why that should be done rather than replacing. But I think we constantly need to be making sure that we have the structures in place to deliver an understanding on conservation philosophy, linking right back to the international charters that underpin conservation. And if I could briefly just say, I think we need to see the return of postgraduate training for conservation professionals. And I'm thinking of, in particular, the MUBC, which I have and a lot of other people gave us the foundation stone. I don't see that type of postgraduate training being given, and I think that's a real shame. And without that, it becomes much, much harder for the professionals I mentioned to get to the top of the ladder.
Great, thanks, Michael. And on the subject of, the role of the third level sector, which is a central player in skills provision, it also has been an innovator, and Barbara Niefline, who works in UCD in the Department of Folklore, represents that move in Ireland in the early 20th century to collect our heritage, in particular the intangible cultural heritage, through the Irish Folklore Commission. And they do an extraordinary work out in Belfield in the protection of the folklore of Ireland and sometimes the hidden and what would be lost heritage of our country. But Barbara, you're working in both the collection of material, the understanding of the practice of cultural heritage, and also I'm aware that the folklore department manages a significant repository. So you too are a heritage manager. And what skills do you see are essential for the future of the protection of heritage through your work out in UCD, please?
Well, thank you very much, Virginia, and again, thank you for the invitation as well, indeed, to be here today, and some fascinating presentations that we heard earlier. As Virginia was saying, I spent my life working, teaching folklore in UCD, and indeed working as well with the National Folklore Collection, which Mary O'Malley, I think, was mentioned earlier. And while the primary function, I suppose, of the collection is obviously, as Virginia was saying, to preserve information and to document various aspects of traditional skills of one kind or another. At the same time, I think it's true to say that myself and my colleagues have also a long history of involvement with various specific conservation projects. So it's not just a question of trying to kind of safeguard what has been there and the documentation of that, but also the hopefully the application of that knowledge to the present day and to current conservation projects and so on. And I must say that my involvement with ICMAS Ireland would also kind of feed into the same general idea. I suppose I would see my brief here this morning that is to kind of address the whole area of vernacular skills specifically. And of course, vernacular skills are also a very important cultural expression. But because of the very kind of popularity and the grassroots nature of so many vernacular skills and practices, they do run the risk at times of being somewhat perhaps undervalued or not having quite the same status as some other heritage skills and competencies and so on. And indeed, an anecdote I was just thinking of earlier this morning, I think illustrates this very well, whereby a former teacher of mine many years ago in UCD, a man called Kevin Danaher, whose name might be familiar to some of you at least. And Kevin Danaher, as I say, taught material culture and folklore in UCD. But Kevin was actually involved with a colleague on one occasion looking at a vernacular house, a traditional house in County Tipperary. But the house also contained some very interesting examples of domestic vernacular furniture. and himself and his colleague asked if they could take some of the chairs specifically that were in the kitchen outside in order to photograph them. And I remember him telling me that the comment of the woman of the house when she saw this happening was, "Aren't they very innocent?" I mean, the idea being that somebody who would actually concern themselves or interest themselves in such a kind of a quotidian, I suppose, and everyday object as a kitchen chair, it does reflect the fact that familiarity, it doesn't always breed contempt, hopefully, but it can breed a lack of appreciation. And this is something that can apply to vernacular skills and practices and so on. It's something we need to be aware of. In any case, looking at the whole kind of conservation area from a very practical point of view, there are two things which I'd like to focus on particularly in my brief few words here this morning. The first of these, and again this would kind of overlap to a considerable extent with what Michael was saying and indeed the previous speakers as well, the whole idea of thatching. And I'm going to focus on thatching, and I want to say a few words about that specifically, because thatching is obviously emblematic of the whole area of vernacular architecture, vernacular buildings in Ireland, and this is an area which I have had some involvement with myself over the years. Thatching and the whole idea of the Irish thatched house, I mean, it obviously has iconic status in Ireland, and it does represent, as I say, just one of the more visible, I suppose, high profile of the skills attached to vernacular buildings. But there are many others. There are masonry skills, there are metalwork skills, there are, again, the making of domestic furniture and so on, the whole use of wickerwork, straw and rope artefacts of one kind or another. I mean, you know, it's a whole vast range of skills and practices relating to the building and indeed the conservation, the preservation of vernacular buildings. But thatching, as I say, is something that is particularly iconic, and it's very much part of the kind of image of Ireland that so many people have, not just people outside of Ireland, people in Ireland as well. And there has, as many of you will know, been an absolutely frightening disappearance of thatched buildings in Ireland over the past couple of generations. And this is for various reasons, but the situation really continues to be quite extremely serious and very, very grave. And this, I should say, is also despite the best efforts of a number of people working in this field, including Barry O'Reilly, a colleague indeed of Nessa's, and Fidelma Milan is another person who could be mentioned in this context. And I'm glad to say that Barry has actually produced a strategy and a document which is designed to address the disappearance of our heritage of vernacular buildings, and we are hoping to see the implementation of that strategy over the next few years. And the strategy, as you might expect, also, I'm getting the right pen, the strategy also addresses the whole area of thatching and the necessity to provide training courses for thatchers in Ireland. There have been many attempts at this, at providing training courses for thatchers in the past by various government bodies. Barry O'Reilly tells me that there are plans to institute another training course for thatchers. All of this is very welcome news, and we can only hope that it will incorporate things like regional styles in thatching, so that we don't get the very strange situation that we have at the moment, where you have buildings thatched in a Norfolk reed style of thatching in parts of the west of Ireland, for example, this great incongruity which you can have. But in any case, that's the area of thatching. The other item that I want to mention very, very briefly, Virginia, if you'll bear with me, is the area of tinsmithing. And tinsmithing is something that very much epitomises and illustrates the kind of, I suppose, the lack of status that sometimes attaches to vernacular skills, because tinsmithing is something that was very much identified with an entire section of the Irish community, and that is the traveller community, of course. And equally well, tinsmithing is something that lacks professional training courses, and although some attempts have been made at providing training in this area, a great deal more needs to be done. If I could just finish up with a point as well, that it's not just a question of training people how to thatch or how to produce articles made of tin. In the case of thatching, we also have to factor in the fact that it can be very, very difficult to get suitable materials for thatching. So it's a question of trying to approach these issues in a kind of a joined up way, so that people, and the people who are in charge of these areas, do join up the dots. The materials for thatching are absolutely crucial to the provision of successful thatching schemes. And equally well in the case of tinsmithing, there is a great lack of tools available in order to produce goods and articles made of tin. So again, a more holistic and a more comprehensive overview and approach to issues of training, I think, is essential.
Thanks, Barbara, and that's so insightful, because this is something at the Heritage Council that we've experienced ourselves in our engagement with tinsmithing, the two who are left in Ireland, and then some of the Thatchers. Moving back to the area of skills and skill sets in areas of expertise, Janet is a representative from the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland and is here in our role of chair of ARA, the Archives and Records Association. Documentary heritage also represents significant threats and challenges, I think of equal scale to that summarised there by Barbara. Are there any gaps that you would like to highlight, Janet, in this discussion, and how we might address these gaps in skills?
Thank you very much, Virginia, and echoing everybody else, delighted to be invited to speak to everybody today. Yes, just to give a bit of context, the Archives and Records Association is the professional body, membership organisation across the UK and Ireland, representing archivists, records managers and conservators, with about over 2,000 in the organisation, around 180 of whom are members within the Ireland region. And just to touch on some of the points made earlier about professional bodies and their role in this, our ARA does review the traditional postgraduate courses, which has been very useful and sets that sort of underpinning for professional entry level, and also does a lot of work around pay and review in order to sort of keep organisations accountable, and has more recently developed a competency framework as well to support more of the CPD around archive professional skills, sort of coming in at 3 levels, starting off with sort of foundation level, running up to registered archivist, and then up to fellow level, which usually sort of sits at senior and director level. So, but again, plenty more work to do in that area. I suppose in terms of the question about skills gaps, I wanted to highlight a couple. One, I suppose, new and evolving in the sphere of digital preservation, and one existing, but I would say undervalued and under-recognised as a skill set, which comes around community engagement. Sort of moving back to the digital preservation, I think really interesting in session 1, we heard a lot of projects which focused on the use of digital technology and digital engagement, and absolutely fantastic vehicle for engagement, gives you a global reach, but the challenges that we face as archivists is really the long-term preservation of that work that's going on to date. I work in the Public Record Office, official archive for Northern Ireland. We've around 3 million records. Our earliest record dates back to the 13th century. It's easier for me to go into the stores and get that record out than it is for me to open a floppy disk from the 90s. And that is part of the huge challenge that we're facing in archives. With great opportunities posed by digital, comes the sort of challenge of making sure that in 100, 200, 300 years' time, we're still going to be able to access that memory. I suppose I would say archives are repositories of stories and memory. We can pick up lots from diaries, letters people used to write. You know, somebody's referenced already the huge reach of the Irish diaspora, and that's reflected in migrant letters from the last several centuries. We now live our sort of engagement life on Instagram and Facebook, and our social commentary, which was once written down on paper is now written down, I think, in a very virtual and very transient world. So I think there's a massive challenge as to how people, even in 10 or 20 years, never mind 100 years, will understand our thinking and understand where we were as a community and as individuals down the line. There are relatively few sort of, I suppose, experts in this field because it's such an evolving field. Now, there are lots of fabulous organisations, Digital Repository Ireland, the Digital Preservation Coalition, but I suppose I mean within organisations where other archivists can learn what one of our former directors used to call it Nelly's elbow, where you learn in situ from somebody there. So we're putting our sort of new professionals even coming into this in quite a challenging position. I suppose, so the skills gap comes in understanding that sort of role and what skills are required, how those new skills, which is really taking cutting edge technology, such as AI and all of the sort of technical side of that, and merging that with the traditional skills of the archivists, how you facilitate a knowledge transfer between those. You know, questions like our traditional archivists upskilling in digital skills, or I suppose as Kieran mentioned, are we working more collaboratively? And I think that's very much is a point. The other one I just wanted to quickly mention was really around the idea of community engagement, and I think that has really come about as part of the discussions. There's not any point in preserving things or creating lovely, fancy online virtual resources if people don't know how to use them. And I think there's a very under-recognised and undervalued skill set of people who are able to bridge that gap. I was speaking to, at tea break, I was speaking to a school principal who was here from an interest in bringing the heritage world into the education world, and was sort of saying, didn't know lots of this stuff existed. I think there's a huge gap in the market, and it is being trained in some of the public history and some of the modules. I think it's getting organisations who live in a world of grading and role profiles to understand and keep up with the evolving nature of the skills that professionals need now in the archiving world. So yes, it's really acknowledging that there's a role that lives between taking what you've got and understanding your asset and your material and your archive and your heritage, and also understanding the world that your audience lives in, be that community or individuals, be that in particular sectors. You know, the ability to stand with a foot in both camps and become that bridge to help people gain and get that knowledge. And I think Kieran, who we've partnered with in the Virtual Record Treasury, gave that example of you have a fabulous product, but you have to go to Donegal and tell people about it. You know, and I think there's work to be done in bringing out that skill, and people who can use the arts and creativity. Again, the arts has traditionally been a way of engaging people with complex and sometimes very challenging narratives. I think taking creativity in the arts and bringing that into the cultural sector and people with the skill sets to do that is a great leveller. Lots of people don't want to engage because they don't have a history degree, don't have a background. So yeah, it's understanding that there's a skill set and collaboration that lives in there.
Thank you, Janet. And I'm sorry I have to be a bit brutal with the speakers, but we're on time constraints, and Nessa won't forgive me if I go over the 70 minutes. But just to summarise our very brief roundtable here, I think there are a few main themes emerging, and that's around the requirement to ensure that those areas within heritage practice, particularly those areas that touch on the specialist protection of heritage as reflected in the role of the Conservator, the specialist curatorial work performed by specialist curators and archivists, and indeed the work of our built heritage colleagues and those working in folklore and other areas of heritage practice, that there is a need to support professional standards, to support accreditation. And it was interesting to hear the contrast between those regulated two professional groups, the archivists and the architects, where practice requires membership of a professional body, which is then monitored, as is the training course, to the areas where there's perhaps a more flexible approach to training and entry into career paths. And I think that flexibility is key, because there are parts of heritage that require a much less prescribed approach, particularly if you go into the area of the crafts practice, where perhaps people are coming from an educational base which is less traditional and maybe less academic, and they find their own qualities are best expressed in an applied area. And finding a way to support the entry and sustaining those people and facilitating good quality careers is really important. For me, Janet's points are particularly around the world of emerging technology and its interface with heritage is so important, and Kieran's really wonderful and insightful presentation this morning on the work of the virtual treasury demonstrates the opportunities that exist in the space between technology, computers and the heritage practitioner, and perhaps those in the room who may be involved in the training of heritage professionals could consider the richness of the digital-born natives, those young people who are less than 20 years old, who have at their fingertips digital skills, which can be applied in a way which is creative and which can make our heritage accessible in new ways. And the use of AI is going to be revolutionary, and possibly for an old-fashioned archivist like me, the way I was trained would do me out of a job, and that's not a bad thing either. And also the presentations this morning, particularly from ICANN, and I say this from a position of prejudice because the Heritage Council is a partner with the museum on the delivery of ICANN, but it's a really exemplary project about the power of communities and the power of community engagement. And this is something too that those of us who are involved in either supporting skills training or directly in the provision of skills training, these graduate attributes of ensuring that our young professionals are aware of the importance of community and are skilled with those particular values of inclusion, of listening, of making sure that community participation is the leading force, not the expert force is leading. It's expert-fed but community-led. And these values are important to get into the minds, I think, of our future professionals because they are, I think, important in the future of heritage. I would like to finish by thanking all our panellists. They've all had little time to prepare for this. Every one of them have busy lives, and I know it's sometimes hard to get people on a stage for an event like this. I'd like to thank them for volunteering to be here and for spending the time to reflect on the points they were asked to consider. And I'd like to thank all of you for your attention. Gorg míle maith.
Thank you. I have kind of become an informal MC, and I'd like to say there's no need for me to do any concluding. This has been a really useful discussion. It's been great, it's been engaging, and I think everybody here has been writing notes, learning from what's been said on the stage. And thank you very much to all of you and Virginia for bringing it together, those strands together.